Hello, my friends. What we are witnessing today in the ongoing discussion surrounding Ukraine is not diplomacy in any serious sense of the word, but rather theater, carefully staged optics designed to create the illusion of progress while avoiding the one unavoidable truth. Russia is winning this war, and peace will only come on Russian terms. Much has been made of recent meetings, handshakes, and carefully worded statements claiming that negotiations are 90 to 95% complete. This language is not merely misleading, it is fundamentally dishonest. The remaining 5% is not a technicality. It is the core of the entire conflict. It is Russia's consent. And that consent has not been given because the proposals being floated are structurally unacceptable to Moscow. From the outset of the special military operation on the 24th of February 2022, President Vladimir Putin articulated Russia's objectives with clarity. Ukraine must be neutral. It must not serve as a NATO forward operating base. And the security of Russian-speaking populations, particularly in the Donbass, must be guaranteed. None of these positions have meaningfully changed. The West, however, continues to behave as though repetition will somehow transform rejection into acceptance. The fundamental error made by Washington and Kiev is the belief that Russia can be coerced into accepting a ceasefire that merely freezes the conflict, allowing Ukraine time to rearm, regroup, and prepare for the next phase of confrontation. Moscow has already lived through this deception twice, Minsk I and Minsk II. Russian leaders have openly acknowledged that those agreements were exploited by the West to buy time, not to secure peace. There will not be a third act in this farce. Russia's military posture reflects this reality. While Western commentators obsess over symbolic counterattacks and short-term fluctuations along the front, the strategic trajectory is unmistakable. Russian forces are advancing methodically, deliberately, and sustainably. This is not a war of spectacle. It is a war of attrition conducted according to classical military logic. Territory is taken when it can be held. Logistics are disrupted before major offensives. Infrastructure is degraded systematically. Odessa, long regarded as untouchable, is increasingly exposed to shaping operations that suggest it may no longer remain outside the scope of Russian objectives. This brings us to the central misunderstanding in Western discourse. The notion that Ukraine, despite losing on the battlefield, retains the right to dictate terms. History offers no precedent for such an outcome. The losing side does not design the settlement. That is not how wars end. Yet Western media continues to portray Russia as the obstacle to peace for refusing arrangements that would objectively weaken its own security. The diplomatic posture of Moscow is often mischaracterized as inflexible. In reality, it is consistent. Russia is willing to negotiate, but not to surrender the very goals for which it has sacrificed blood, resources, and political capital. The territories now incorporated into the Russian Federation are not bargaining chips. They are constitutional realities. No Russian leader, Putin or otherwise, could survive politically after relinquishing them, nor would Russian society tolerate it. At the same time, Russia is under no internal pressure to accept a suboptimal deal. Contrary to persistent Western narratives, the Russian state has proven remarkably resilient. The economy has adapted to sanctions with unexpected efficiency. Trade has been redirected eastward. Industrial capacity has expanded. The ruble has stabilized. Daily life continues with far fewer disruptions than predicted by Western analysts who assumed economic collapse was inevitable. Sanctions, once heralded as a decisive weapon, have instead become an instrument of self-harm for Europe. Energy shortages, deindustrialization, inflation, and political fragmentation now define the European landscape. Governments cling to ideological slogans as long as it takes because admitting failure would mean acknowledging that they bet their economies and social stability on a losing strategy. Meanwhile, Ukraine itself remains trapped in a vortex of corruption so entrenched that it has become systemic. Billions in Western aid vanish into opaque networks of patronage and embezzlement. Investigations surface only at the margins, carefully contained, to avoid implicating the central power structure in Kyiv. To suggest that this corruption stops at the presidential office requires a suspension of disbelief bordering on the absurd. It is within this context that Western leaders continue to speak of security guarantees, peacekeepers, and free economic zones. These concepts exist only in conference rooms and press releases. On the ground, they are meaningless. Russian military planners do not distinguish between NATO forces deployed under Article 5 and NATO forces deployed under a bilateral agreement. Targets are targets. There is also a deeper geopolitical dimension that Western policymakers seem either unwilling or unable to grasp. Ukraine is not the primary issue in U.S.-Russian relations. It is a theater within a much larger strategic realignment. Russia's partnerships with China, India, and the broader global South are not temporary conveniences. They are structural shifts. The attempt to isolate Russia has instead accelerated the emergence of alternative economic and political centers of gravity. Europe, increasingly sidelined, behaves like an excluded party peering through the window at negotiations it no longer controls. Lacking both military capacity and diplomatic credibility, European leaders resort to moral posturing and fear-mongering, warning their populations of an imminent Russian invasion that exists nowhere outside their own rhetoric. Russia does not need to destroy Europe. Europe is doing that to itself. In the final analysis, the choice facing Ukraine and its Western backers is stark. Either accept the strategic realities as they exist today, or continue down a path that will leave Ukraine smaller, poorer, and more fractured than before. Russia can afford to wait. Time, demographics, industrial capacity, and battlefield momentum are on its side. No deal is better than a bad deal. Moscow understands this, and until Washington and Kyiv do as well, all talk of being 95% there will remain what it has always been, an empty slogan masking strategic defeat. When examining the war in Ukraine, one of the most persistent failures of Western analysis is the inability to detach ideology from power realities. Strategy is not shaped by slogans, moral posturing, or preferred narratives. It is shaped by geography, industrial capacity, logistics, manpower, energy, time, and the balance of power. When those variables are examined honestly, without the insulation of Western political mythology, the direction of this conflict becomes unmistakably clear. A fundamental misunderstanding begins with Russia's relationship with China. It is frequently portrayed in Western discourse as a perfectly aligned, mutually reinforcing partnership of equals. This is an illusion. While Russia and China certainly complement each other, China with its manufacturing base, technological depth, and scale, Russia with its energy, raw materials, agricultural capacity, military experience, and geographic reach, the relationship is structurally asymmetric. China is a hyperpower. Russia is a great power, but not China's equal. That imbalance matters profoundly in strategic thinking. Great powers do not base their long-term security on goodwill or presumed intent. They hedge against capability. Intent changes, leadership changes, strategic priorities evolve. What is benign today may become coercive tomorrow. This is not paranoia. It is the foundational logic of international relations. Russia understands this as well as any serious strategic actor. A single hyperpower sitting on Russia's border, increasingly dominant economically and technologically, represents a latent strategic vulnerability, regardless of present friendliness. The reduction of Russian energy exports to Europe, an outcome driven largely by European political decisions rather than Russian necessity, has concentrated Russia's energy trade increasingly toward China and, to a lesser extent, India. This concentration reduces Moscow's strategic flexibility. Should Beijing ever choose to apply pressure through pricing, volumes, or political conditions, Russia's options would be constrained. That does not require hostile intent today. It merely requires recognition that dependency creates leverage. This is precisely why Russia retains an interest, however limited and pragmatic, in maintaining a functional relationship with the United States. Not as an ally, not militarily, but as a counterbalance. Trade relationships, diplomatic engagement, and strategic dialogue serve to prevent Russia from slipping into economic or political subordination to a single dominant power. Balance of power politics never disappeared. Western elites simply stopped acknowledging it. From the American perspective, the logic mirrors this reality. A fully consolidated Sino-Russian bloc would dramatically accelerate China's global ascent, not only economically, but militarily and strategically, including in the Arctic and Eurasia. Preventing such consolidation has long been a core American interest, whether openly admitted or not. This is why engagement with Russia, even amid conflict, remains strategically rational. This broader framework is essential for understanding the current phase of the war and the diplomatic theater surrounding it. Claims of imminent peace, breakthroughs, or near-complete agreements are detached from reality. The core issues remain unresolved, and they are not peripheral. They are central. Territory, security architecture, Western military influence, and Ukraine's alignment are the war's essence. On these points, there is no convergence. On the battlefield, the trend remains consistent. Russia advances incrementally, methodically, and persistently across multiple sectors. These are not spectacular breakthroughs designed for headlines. They are grinding, attritional gains driven by fire superiority, industrial endurance, and manpower depth. Ukraine's counteractions, where they occur, are localized, costly, and rarely sustained. Across the northern fronts near Kupiansk and Volchansk, through the Donbass and into the southern sectors, Russian forces continue to apply pressure, exploit Ukrainian weaknesses, and consolidate control. Ukrainian mechanized assaults, often conducted under adverse weather conditions such as heavy fog and snow, are increasingly detected and neutralized by Russian FPV drones, artillery, and layered defenses. The winter environment favors Russia's strengths and amplifies Ukraine's vulnerabilities. Weather slows maneuver but increases lethality. Firepower dominates movement. This dynamic benefits the side with greater ammunition stocks, artillery production, and drone saturation capacity. Ukraine lacks the industrial base and manpower reserves to sustain prolonged winter attrition indefinitely. This is not a moral judgment. It is a material assessment. What is perhaps most revealing is not the battlefield movement itself, but the informational silence surrounding it. Entire sectors have gone largely unreported in Western media for months. This silence reflects narrative collapse. When reality diverges too far from messaging, omission becomes the preferred tactic. The political dimension mirrors this disconnect. High-level meetings, press conferences, and carefully staged statements create the illusion of progress without substance. Calls for ceasefires exemplify strategic illiteracy. Ceasefires benefit the side losing momentum. They allow time for rearmament and repositioning. Russia has no incentive to halt operations while advancing. None. Nor would any rational military actor. The suspicion from Moscow's perspective that a ceasefire would merely serve as a pause for Western rearmament of Ukraine is entirely justified based on recent precedent. Likewise, rhetoric about reconstruction and goodwill obscures the reality that Russia's objective is political control over Ukraine's strategic orientation. Any future Ukrainian success envisioned by Moscow would be conditional on neutrality, demilitarization, and exclusion from hostile military alliances. Assertions that negotiations are 90% complete or very close are meaningless. In diplomacy, unresolved core issues invalidate all peripheral agreement. If territory, security guarantees, and Western military presence are treated as non-negotiable by Kyiv, then there is no agreement at all, regardless of how many minor points are provisionally accepted. This is why recent diplomatic engagements, despite their cordial tone, achieved nothing of substance. They did not narrow the strategic gap. If anything, they revealed how far apart the parties remain. The United States increasingly appears interested in a settlement. Europe continues to pursue the illusion of Russian collapse. This divergence is growing, and Russia understands it well. By sustaining battlefield pressure while engaging diplomatically just enough to keep Washington invested, Moscow maximizes leverage and accelerates fractures within the Western alliance. Should the United States eventually disengage, European capacity to sustain Ukraine's war effort collapses with it. Russia is playing a long game grounded in material reality, not moral fantasy. Wars end when one side achieves its objectives or the other accepts the limits of its power. Ukraine currently lacks both the means to reverse battlefield trends and the political flexibility to negotiate. Under those conditions, the war will continue until it reaches its military conclusion. History is unforgiving. Every prolonged war appears, in retrospect, to have lasted longer than it should have. This one will be no different. The tragedy is not that compromise is difficult, but that denial has been elevated to policy. And denial, when confronted by power, always loses. The events that unfolded during the night of December 28-29 mark a decisive rupture in the already fragile illusion surrounding negotiations between Russia and the United States. What occurred was not merely another Ukrainian drone strike deep inside Russian territory. It was, in both intent and execution, an attempted assassination of the President of the Russian Federation, carried out under the cover of diplomatic engagement and facilitated by NATO's technical and intelligence infrastructure. Pasted. According to the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, confirmed publicly by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, the Kyiv regime launched a coordinated attack involving 91 long-range unmanned aerial vehicles against the official presidential residence of Vladimir Putin in the Novgorod region. All drones were intercepted by Russian air defenses. No casualties were reported, and no structural damage resulted from falling debris. But to focus on the absence of physical damage is to fundamentally misunderstand the strategic gravity of the event. This attack occurred at a moment of intense diplomatic activity between Moscow and Washington. Negotiations were ongoing. Direct communication channels between Vladimir Putin and the President of the United States were active. In fact, a follow-up call between the two leaders was anticipated after discussions between Washington and Kyiv. The timing was not coincidental. It was instrumental. Lavrov was explicit. Russia will not withdraw from negotiations, but its negotiating position will be revised in light of Ukraine's definitive shift towards state terrorism. That phrase, state terrorism, was not chosen lightly. Attempting to strike the residence of the head of state of the world's leading nuclear power is not a battlefield tactic. It is a strategic escalation of the highest order. Geography alone exposes the falsity of claims that this was a purely Ukrainian operation. Novgorod lies nearly 1,000 kilometers from Ukrainian territory. Ukrainian drones do not possess the independent satellite reconnaissance, navigation, precision, electronic warfare, suppression, and real-time targeting capabilities required to conduct such an operation at that depth. This was not improvisation. It was not symbolic. It was a NATO-enabled strike. Whether or not every political authority in Washington formally signed off on it, the question of whether Vladimir Putin was physically present at the Novgorod residence at the time of the attack remains officially unanswered. That ambiguity is deliberate. Russian operational security relies on redundancy. Identical secure communication rooms exist in multiple locations. The Kremlin, Novo-Ogaryovo near Moscow, and Novgorod specifically to obscure the president's true whereabouts. The attack suggests that the planners believed, or were led to believe, that Putin would be at Novgorod at that precise moment. That belief did not arise in a vacuum. The diplomatic choreography of the preceding days is critical. Prior to the strike, Putin and the U.S. president had spoken directly. A further call was expected following talks between Washington and Vladimir Zelensky. Yet that call did not occur on schedule. Instead, during the window in which Putin was reportedly waiting for renewed contact, the drone swarm was already en route. This pattern is disturbingly familiar. It mirrors earlier precedents in which negotiations already stalled or effectively dead were suddenly revived to create the appearance of diplomatic momentum, only to be used as a strategic distraction. In Iran's case, prolonged talks were exploited to lower guard and gather intelligence before a coordinated strike by Israel with U.S. foreknowledge. In this instance, Ukraine played the proxy role, but the structure of deception is strikingly similar. Russian officials had reason to believe, days earlier, that a breakthrough was possible. Statements by senior diplomats suggested optimism unprecedented in recent months. Signals from U.S. envoys imply that Washington might finally pressure Kyiv toward capitulation or at least meaningful concessions. In hindsight, those signals now appear less like genuine diplomacy and more like bait. The operational details further reinforce this interpretation. 91 drones were not launched at random targets across the city. They were routed toward a specific complex, a specific site, likely a specific structure within that site. This was not a message. It was an attempt at decapitation. Western media's attempt to downplay the incident or to frame it as another routine Ukrainian strike collapses under minimal scrutiny. Attacks on symbolic infrastructure are one thing. An attack on a presidential residence during live negotiations is another entirely. It represents a crossing of a red line that cannot be undone by rhetorical damage control. Russian responses have been deliberately restrained in tone but unambiguous in substance. Lavrov, Kremlin spokespersons, and senior security officials have all emphasized that retaliation is inevitable, that targets and timing have been determined, and that the response will not be diplomatic. At the same time, Russia has made clear it will not abandon talks, not out of weakness, but to underscore that it was not Moscow that shattered the framework of diplomacy. The burden of escalation now rests elsewhere. The Novgorod drone attack cannot be understood without addressing NATO's indirect but indispensable role, regardless of whether the U.S. president possessed full foreknowledge. The operational reality is unavoidable. Ukraine lacks the independent capability to execute a precision strike at such depth inside Russian territory. Satellite guidance, real-time intelligence, electronic warfare coordination, and navigation correction all point to external assistance. This was not a unilateral Ukrainian action. It was structurally NATO-enabled. Public reactions from Washington followed a familiar pattern. Expressions of surprise, verbal indignation, and claims of ignorance mirror earlier episodes, most notably after strikes on Russian strategic airfields and prior escalations involving Iran. In each case, initial denials were later contradicted by circumstantial evidence or subsequent admissions. The performance of shock has become a diplomatic reflex rather than a credible position. More revealing than words was timing. The attack coincided precisely with a diplomatic pause after initial Putin-U.S. contact, during negotiations with Kyiv, and before an expected follow-up call. This interval created a window in which Russian leadership could plausibly be stationary, engaged, and exposed. Whether Putin was physically present in Novgorod is ultimately secondary. The planners believed the probability was sufficient to act. This aligns with a broader pattern of deception-based strategy. Revive stalled negotiations, signal compromise, induce lowered alertness, then strike. The same logic was applied to Iran, where prolonged talks created political cover for a surprise attack. Here, Ukraine functioned as the operational proxy, but the strategic architecture is unmistakably Western. For Moscow, the implications are stark. Negotiations can no longer be treated as parallel to military risk. They have become potential instruments of attack. Trust, already minimal, has effectively collapsed. Russia's decision to remain at the negotiating table is therefore not conciliatory, it is tactical, preserving moral and diplomatic clarity while preparing an inevitable response. The Novgorod incident marks a transition. From Russia's perspective, this was not merely an escalation in the Ukraine conflict, but a direct challenge to the personal security of the Russian head of state. Such acts are not authorized lightly, nor by intermediaries acting alone. Responsibility, even if diffused, resides at the highest strategic levels. In that sense, the attack failed tactically but succeeded in clarifying reality. Diplomacy is no longer separate from the battlefield. It has become part of it.